Greetings everyone, it is Zakhele here and welcome back to the channel. This week, in keeping really with holding the state accountable has been our theme really over the past couple of weeks, I want to talk about corruption, specifically permanent solutions to corruption, right? In South Africa, we usually are currently dealing with like the implications of this very, very big state and how corrupt it actually is, right? Whether you go into the health sector or currently whether you go into policing, whether you go into just normal service delivery, right? I live in Johannesburg and we currently was reading a story about how certain employees from our municipal power provider in City Power were actually arrested for graft and things like that. So this is a problem that seems to be endemic across a lot of South African state institutions. I would argue it is a problem that is endemic across every state institution across the world. Maybe you can say it varies by degree, but I know specifically for South Africa it is a pretty huge problem in our state institutions, right? So the idea of corruption, of patronage networks, of just really looking out for one's self-interest when they are in a position to supposedly look out for collective interest. But if you're a libertarian, that would not surprise you. This does not surprise me, right? You would say that I am biased because I am anti-state in most things outside of the protection of life, liberty, and property. But I would say that show me a human being that is not driven by self-interest, and I think you would have found the first angel walking among human beings, right? Because by our nature as human beings, we are driven by self-interest. Self-interest, when it is pursued without harming others, is actually a good thing. It is what creates prosperity, what drives innovation, what makes people want to create things that benefit others, knowing that they will personally benefit from doing so. Self-interest is a good thing in general, but limited to the scope or within this context of state institutions, you start seeing how having a huge state is problematic, right? Where a lot of people will say, oh no, but self-interest is the problem. But as I have explained, that is not the problem. The problem is giving beings like you and me, human beings, access to power and expecting them not to act following their self-interest. That is asking, again, as I said, human beings to be angels, something that is pretty impossible. This is why all across the world, right, before we get to South Africa, because people would think that, maybe one is picking on the South African state when, really deserves to be picked on given the amount of problems we do have. But you find this all across the world, from the most advanced economies to third world economies like ours, whereby you see politicians getting wealthy from political office, politicians receiving kickbacks, maybe through family members and things like that. This is something that is pretty endemic, right? Can just look at the current president of the United States using his Truth Social platform as a means of communication, thereby really increasing the prominence of that platform, right? It isn't a direct kickback, it isn't barred by US law for him to do that, right? But it definitely is a conflict of interest when you're gonna use a social media platform that you own as a head of state to communicate to your citizens, right? And then in South Africa, we all are pretty aware. Recently, we had the deputy president of the country, right? We had his sister-in-law receive a tender, a contract to run the state national lottery, right? A pretty lucrative contract. And we just continued on with our lives as we seemingly have continued on with it, knowing that that contract was most likely awarded due to the proximity said sister-in-law of the deputy president has with the deputy president. And I don't think it is a secret to assume that the deputy president himself, right, would benefit from the issuing of that particular tender to a family member of his. And that is only just one example. The deputy president should not feel hard done by that. I'm using him as an example. He is within company that is pretty well known for doing such things, right? We had the recent Minister of Higher Education, I think, who was let go because they chose Gwede Mandashe's son to be a member of a SETA board, right? Sex Education and Training Authorities that exist in South Africa all throughout the different industries, right? He was nominated to be a board member of a particular SETA, and the minister, the entire process really deserves a video by its own self. But the point that I'm making here is that in South South Africa, we're pretty well aware the idea that if you're a politician, you are gonna act regarding your self-interest. You're gonna give the people you know, people you're connected to, contracts, because that is how human beings are. At least that is what I say. What is the solution, though? Right? One may think that we are pretty defeatist by saying that self-interest exists, self-interest is good, and as such, corruption is good, corruption is horrible, corruption is bad, and where it can be proven, of course, it should be prosecuted. That goes without saying. But as a permanent solution to corruption is to not give human beings powers that only should be given to angels, for lack of a better term, powers that only should be given to men who do not act immorally, men who are always upstanding, men and women, really, I'm using it in a general term, who are always gonna follow the most ethical of solutions. And as I said, if you find that man or woman walking amongst us, I think you may have found the first instance of an angel walking amongst human beings. And as such, we set ourselves up for corrupt societies when we expand the state, when we make it grow. Currently in South Africa, right, according to various counts, we have over 700 SOEs, if you consider, all the various institutions that act as enterprises and their subsidiaries. We have over 700 of them. To me, that represents over 700, just 700 instances whereby corruption can and definitely will be cultivated, right? Instead of growing the state, I say limits. Instead of trying to change people, just make sure that they don't have access to power whereby they can harm people. And the best way to do that is just limit the things that the state does. Instead of it being contingent on a particular individual, whether something gets done or not, just remove that power altogether and let the market, let the people themselves voluntarily acting, because that's what a market is, people voluntarily interacting with one another. Let us decide what is best for us in most cases than not. That is why, right, if you've been following most of the work that we do here at the FMF, we have things like Liberty First, where we mention things like decreasing the size and scope of the state, and it is primarily due to this reason. So to me, really, I say that the most permanent solution to corruption is really just reducing the size and the scope of the state. By doing that, you are reducing avenues upon which corruption can happen. Thereby, you don't even have to worry whether the person is good or not, because there would be no power for anyone to abuse. I think in the long term, this is how we ensure that our society is really, I don't want to say more ethical or more just, because that is much more of a longer term project, but at least our societies won't suffer the harmful consequences of corruption and graft, whereby we have taxpayer funds being appropriated for people's personal gain. But that is my solution to it. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you think that, the state needs to be as big as it is, and somehow we have to find the most ethical. You just have to try and find ethical people who won't act according to their self-interest. I, of course, disagree, and I have stated my reason for that, but please do tell me your reason for disagreeing with me. Tell me your reasons for agreeing with me. Give the video a like. If you liked it, share it to anyone who may be interested. Subscribe if you're unsubscribed. This is Z, and as always, stay free.